what you're going to notice is there's a cycle that's happening in sourdough starter. This stage is just refreshed. So active sourdough starter is when it is doubled in volume. You can see the difference in volume from just refreshed to this batch. We get to this discard stage where it is. So let's refresh the starter so I can show you how you care for your sourdough starter. So here's my empty jar, and again, I can do it from this jar, from the active batch, or from the discard batch. I'm gonna use the discard batch, so I'm gonna put my scale over here. And you can use American measurements. I prefer a scale because it's more accurate and it creates more consistent results. And I also don't have to use a bunch of measuring spoons, but I will tell you the American measurements if that's what you have on hand. So I'm going to tear out the scale, which means it's at 0. It takes out the weight of the container. And I'm going to add just a tablespoon amount of my discard, which is about 15 grams. If you're using American measurements, it's about a tablespoon. Now next, I tear it again so it reads 0. I'm going to add my water first. And the reason why you add water first, and whether you're making your sourdough starter or making bread, is that if you add too much, it's easy to pour out a little bit of the excess. So for one batch of bread, I'm going to add 60 grams. Okay, so we're adding about 60 grams for one batch of bread. And if you're using American measurements, that's 1/4 cup. Important part, if you're using a scale, is we want to keep those weights equal. The weight between the water and the flour that we're feeding our starter with should be equal for, this is called 100% hydration, which means equal ratio in weight of water to flour. So there's 66 grams of water in here. Your goal is to add 60 grams, which is equal to 1/4 cup in American measurements. And then we add the same weight of flour as we added water. So because I added 66 grams of water, I added 66 grams of flour. And I'm using all-purpose flour. You can use bread flour. Your goal here is to use a white flour because it's going to give you the same consistent results. Whereas if you start using whole wheat or rye flours, those can be great for other purposes and other goals, but if you want to have a consistent starter that you can keep healthy and it's easy to manage and maintain, you're going to want to use white flour. All right, so once I give that a good stir, I want to see that there is no more dry flour in there. Also check the sides to make sure that there's not any on the side. Just scrape off the spoon. And if you want this to become active, I like to put the top on and just leave it slightly ajar to leave it at room temperature. This needs to sit for 6 to 12 hours. That range depends on your water temperature, the air temperature in the room. Your 6 to 8 hours is going to be when it's warm weather, summertime. And then your 10 to 12 hours is going to be what you're looking for in the wintertime. Now that we've refreshed our starter from the discard stage, let's quickly review these 3 stages. This stage is just refreshed. There's a small portion of sourdough starter, about 10% to the 10% of the old batch to 90% of about 90% of the new food for our starter. So it smells like raw flour. There's no bubbles in it yet. It looks very pasty and rough. As it sits out at room temperature, in a few hours it'll become active. So active sourdough starter is when it is doubled in volume. You can see the difference in volume from just refreshed to this batch. It's going to double in volume. It's going to have large bubbles, lots of activity. You also see that once it gets to its peak, it will slightly recede. It'll have a fruity aroma. And then if we have a cup of water, when we take a tablespoon of this starter and drop it into that water, it's going to float on top. That shows that the proteins and the gluten still has enough strength that it's holding in those pockets of gas and to float on top. Once it becomes too exhausted, that yeast has been exhausted, the food is broken down, the flour, it becomes discard. Discard stage, the 3rd stage here, is when the starter has been sitting out at room temperature for 15 to 24 hours. It will get to this discard stage where it is little to no bubbles. Like there's a little bit of small bubbles in there, but it has more of a liquid consistency. It's going to smell really sour. Sometimes it even smells like a nail polish remover. And this is the stage where it needs to be refreshed in order to bring it back to the active, healthy stage. So those are the 3 stages of sourdough starter. I hope that video was helpful for you. Please like it if it was, and share it with a friend. And if you like this content and want to see more, you can subscribe. And down in the description box, you can see some of the resources I'm using, my resource guides, as well as how to find my online courses if you really want to get started and see the full process of making sourdough. Leave me a comment. Let me know, what are you getting stuck on? What would you like to see more of? That really helps me decide what to create for you in the future. Thank you for being here.